Hey,
What's up, Evan?
how's it going?
Yo, it's me again.
Cool. Is everything okay on my screen? Look, I'm seeing some flashing.
Oh wait, hold on one second.
Sure.
Oh man, I'm getting like a loop of speech right now, trying to figure out where it's all coming from.
Oh, hold on a second.
So what were you asking?
I was asking if you can see anything, see everything okay on my screen.
Yep, I see two panels. I see Code
Cool.
Studio and their webpage.
All right. Well, welcome, welcome, Zach. Um, so to start today, I thought I'd keep things a little more to the ground for the week 1 through 5 webinar than last time. I got a little off the rails, so we're gonna do a PSD replica.
Oh, nice. I real quick when
Yeah.
just popping in, I thought it was at 6 Pacific Standard Time. So I was just popping into the chat to see if it was still happening at that time.
Let me double check and make sure I didn't misadvertise. Shoot, you are correct. Okay, well, here we go. Anyway, I don't imagine it will upset a lot of people's schedules. So, and it will be recorded and always available. So, forgive me, the rest of you who are watching this in the future. All right. Let me write a quick message about that in the chat.
But well, I have to jet currently. I was just popping in to see if that was
Okay.
the case.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry about that. But I'm going to go ahead and just carry forward with the recording, and you can definitely catch it later.
Awesome, man. Dude, Godspeed to you, brother.
Yeah, thanks. You too.
Thanks, man. Peace.
All right. Well, looks like I've lost my audience. But in the meantime, as I said, we're going to do a PSD replica. Keep things a little more relevant to the content for the first couple weeks of material. So this is going to be what we're going to be recreating. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be on point, and the image is deliberately low res so that we can't get in close and noodle too much. But we are going to do our best to recreate the feel and layout of this site, which we see here. So let's go ahead and get started. As always, the first step should be to paper prototype, but I'm going to start by organizing my content with some comments. I'm going to declare a hero section, and then about what we're good at section, our philosophy section, the team section, and stay in touch. All right. All right then. Oops. So let's get started. The hero section. Well, I'm going to make it an actual section, and I'll give it an ID of hero. Now it looks like there is some kind of background image in that hero section, but it's pretty blurry, so I'm not going to take a snapshot of it, obviously. Instead, what I'll do is I'll jump onto a site like pexels.com, which is a website for sourcing free stock photography. And I'm going to look for, I don't know, how about business meeting? Okay, that'll do. And let's go. I want to, and this is really about what to think about when you're sourcing images for a site. I know it's a background image, and I know there's going to be white text on top. So I want to make sure that that text, which is obviously going to be some of the most important on the website, is very, very readable. So in order to make sure that's the case, hey, I got some more people. For the rest of you who are in here, feel free to jump into the Appear chat room dropped in the YouTube video chat, in which case you can watch this in real time and ask me your questions using your human voices, and you won't have to deal with the slight delay of the YouTube live stream. Otherwise, feel free to drop your questions in the YouTube chat, and I will monitor them. So when deciding on a background image to use for a section like that, where I want to be careful that the text is very legible, I want to avoid using images that are too busy in terms of contrast. And just to demonstrate what I mean by that, let me go ahead and open up a blank blank Photoshop document for a minute, and I'll show you what I mean when I'm talking about too much contrast for background images, or too busy in terms of contrast. So let's copy this image. I'm going to paste it in here, make it a little larger, and let me just grab a couple before I show you what I mean. A couple good examples of different types of background images as far as contrast is concerned. It's a good one. Finally, this one's pretty busy. All right, one last one. I want to find now a really good example of a usable background image. Actually, this is pretty perfect. Okay, now we're not talking about the actual content of the picture. Okay, I don't care what it's a picture of right now. I'm just talking about things to consider when you're choosing a background image for a section that has text on top. Some important things to consider are, again, how busy it is in terms of contrast. So what I'm going to do is toss a color layer on top of these, which is going to desaturate all of these photos so we can see exactly what they look like strictly in terms of their black and white values. Okay, so now they're all black and white. And obviously we're going to overlay some color over whichever image we use, and we're going to probably make it a little transparent, but it's still important to consider how text is going to look on top of these. This one in the bottom right, for example, pardon me, the bottom left, this one here has a lot of extremely dark darks and extremely light lights. Right? We've got a lot of very light lights here, which don't stay confined to the outsides of the image. They actually penetrate straight down into the middle of the image. So it would actually be tough to put text right across here, because you'd have text which has to be extremely readable across dark spaces and across one very light space. Well, how do you do that with a text which doesn't say change color right in the middle? And you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that with text. You could do it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would make your life much more difficult. Now, if you decided to put all of your text right in here, you'd be great. Or, right over here, maybe a vertical text box, something like that. You'd be great. But we're web developers. We know that users are going to be on different screen sizes. So if you do that, you have to make sure that as a user's window changes size, this text is never going to somehow invade the problematic light area. As you change the size of your window, the orientation of your background image is liable to shift. And so your text may not be in the safe area here. That's all stuff you need to think about. Let's look at another one. This one up top, change color. This one up top is really nice. It's a nice image, very generic and usable in just about anything. But we have the same problem. We have these very, very dark, honestly the hands too, very, very dark problem areas right in the middle of the composition. So your text would be pretty safe down here. It would be pretty safe up here. You might be able to get away with something right in the middle on top of the arms, but I wouldn't recommend it. It would look weird. It would create a lot of visual tangents. Don't do that. So it's the same principle. You've got a lot of problem areas, and you want to make sure that your text never manages to invade a part of the picture where its legibility is impaired. Okay, the number one priority in any design situation or any web development, design for web development scenario, is clarity. Okay, and images like this can severely impact the clarity of your message, your site's message, your content, and your layout. This is another good one. It's a little bit, this is just another good one because we got a big old area of light straight down the middle. And there's a lot of busyness within that light. There's some dark shapes which are liable to impact your text's visibility. Dark, 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 dark. There's a lot of confusion you have to deal with. On the flip side, if you wanted your text to sit in that light area, it's not a terribly clean, clear-cut area to have to deal with. It would be very easy to compromise the clarity of your text. There's not a whole lot of safe space, consistent safe space in an image like this. You'd have to really change the image in order to kill that sharp contrast that risks hurting your text. Now the image on the bottom, let me bring that back. The image on the bottom is the best choice of the four that we have. One, because it is actually lower contrast, and what I mean by that is the darkest dark in this picture is actually lighter than the darkest dark in any other picture, and I can prove that to you. So I'm going to say the darkest dark is like somewhere here. So that's the darkest dark of this picture, and we have the darkest dark of this picture. Look at that. Or up here, darkest dark of this picture. Okay, so the darkest dark of this composition down here is much lighter, and as a result, that means we're fighting a lot less. So honestly, virtually all of this composition is a safe space for text, except maybe the sweater over here. Do that in a color. It's just much easier to place your text in a composition like this. Okay, so I'm going to use this one as the background image for that hero section, even though it's a bit of a boring picture. So once again, Pexels is a good place to find copyright-free images you can use without attribution. So I'm going to download a medium-sized version of this image. These numbers on the right indicate pixels, and you're almost never going to need an image this big on a website. That's just taking up too much space. So I'm going to go for the medium one, click download, and I'll need to move that into my project folder. Here's my project folder. I'm going to bring this in, and I'm going to change its title to hero image in my image folder. Okay, so we're good to go to use it now. That's our hero section, and our hero section has some text. It looks like an H1, which says Creative UI and UX Studio. Okay. Now we've encountered a... Hey, Cool Deep, how are you? We've encountered a little bit of an issue here. You see how my ampersand is highlighted? That's because this ampersand actually risks being misinterpreted by the HTML doc, by the browser, which is trying to read HTML. So we want to actually use a different kind of character, which will translate into an ampersand. So I'm going to go ahead and look for something like an ampersand ASCII code. And the first thing that pops up is this page titled HTML codes, table of ASCII characters and symbols. And it looks complicated. It's really not. There's the ampersand, the symbol that I want, and here's the code, the HTML number that I want to use for it. So I'm going to copy that, paste it in place of that ampersand, and we're good to go. It also looks like there's a little bit of smaller text above the H1. I'll make it an H6, which says welcome. And notice that UI and UX Studio after creative breaks to a new line. So I'm going to go ahead and add a break in there. Make sure that this text breaks to a new line after creative. Alright, so that's our hero section. I'll come back and deal with what looks like the sliver of a nav bar that we have, but I'm not too worried about that one. And let's move into the what are we good at section. So once again, I'm going to create a section, give it an ID of what are we good at. It's a long ID, but that's okay. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to go ahead and create the sections for the rest of these areas of our site. Okay, so we've got the general architecture of the site. We're keeping it nice and simple, but that's perfectly okay. That's what we're going for here. Let's continue adding some of what we see going on. In the what are we good at section, there's a lot of overlap on this page in general. But what I want you guys to do when you see that kind of overlap and you're trying to either replicate it or achieve something similar is try and imagine those overlapping elements where they're really supposed to be, their static position. Like for me, this mobile apps section here started over here underneath what are we good at. So that's where I'm going to code it. Oh man, I can't undo that. Alright, we'll pretend that's not there. So inside what are we good at, I'm going to create, well, in seeing where this mobile apps bit used to be, what it seems to me is that this section is easily divisible right down the middle. And you all should know how to do that by now. Orange Juice does that. The Visual Arts Replica does that. The MyFolio does that. to a degree. We're simply dividing this section up in the middle. We're starting with the biggest possible divisions we can make. So I'm going to make a div, give it a class of left, and a div with a class of right. And right now, I'm not going to go any more specific than that. So I want to see where else can I divide my sections up straight down the middle. I can do it in philosophy. It's not perfectly down the middle, but it's close enough that I feel comfortable using this same approach. Okay. And how about in stay in touch? There's actually a contact form here on the right and a bunch of other content and copy on the left. So I'm going to add that there as well. Don't forget, guys, you can jump in the chat included in the YouTube chat box if you would like to ask your questions orally and bypass the lag of the YouTube live stream. If not, don't worry about it. All right, let me take a fresh screen cap of this image so we can get rid of all those lines. All right, here's where we can start with. So let's do the what are we good at section. Inside this div on the left, it looks like there's two boxes. The one which contains what are we good at, and the one which contains mobile apps. So I'm going to start by making two divs. And inside of these divs, I'm going to start by adding H1s. Notice that up to this point, I have only written HTML. I haven't even touched CSS yet. That's very deliberate, okay? Too many of you I've seen try to do both at the same time. You create an HTML element and then you try to style it. Sometimes that can be called for, but in general, it risks you losing sight of the forest for the trees. Okay? I'm going to grab some dummy text for these paragraphs underneath both of these headings, pardon me. All right, that should do it. Might be a little bit much. Let's take off a sentence from each of these. Okay, dummy text. That takes care of these two. I'll come back and deal with that little arrow. And in div with the class of right, inside what are we good at, we just have an image of a hand holding a cell phone. So let's jump back to pixels and try finding something along those lines. Okay, got some nice options. I'm going to look for one that's nice and simple because this has that very convenient green background. It's too old of a cell phone. I like that this one is a very bold color. But we can try to colorize one ourselves. Alright, why not? I'm gonna download a small version of this because I don't need a version of this picture that's as big as my hero image. So, small, download. Drag it into my images folder. Rename it, something easy. And let's go ahead and add that in an image element. moving on, let's do the philosophy section. Now it's a good time to ask, where was this image previously? Was it on the left or on the right? Well, I think it was probably on the right. You could make an argument for the left, but I'm going to put it on the right. If it was on the right, that means that the left is really empty. It's just a big old box of color. So inside of div.right, let's create a div which will contain all of that text. And in fact, I'll just copy this div here. Change mobile apps to our philosophy. And beneath it, I will add an image element. We're going to need to find an image for this. And this can be another business meeting image, but this one doesn't need to be concerned about contrast because there's no text on top of it. So this one will do. Again, I'll download a smaller version because that's still pretty big, 640 by 426 pixels, and I can stretch it a little bit without losing too much quality if I want to. When building a website, your images, JPEG, ooh, gotta fix that. Your images are the very first thing that will compromise your load time. They tend to be very, very large files. Let me rename it to meeting. Okay. And there's the team. Let's go ahead and pause there and get these three sections looking a little more appropriate. Before I jump into CSS, I'm actually going to try to create some utility class names of my own. So I'm going to try to look for patterns in my site. For example, I see that I have 1, 2, 3 headings which are all entirely uppercase text. Our philosophy, what are we good at, and this creative UI and UX studio. I could have written my text as uppercase, but maybe somewhere down the line I don't want this text to be all uppercase. I would rather be able to change one CSS property rather than actually rewrite the copy inside 3 different HTML tags, or probably more because there's a 4th one right there with team. So instead, I'm going to give all the H1s that I see, or all the headings that I see, which are fully uppercase, a custom class of uppercase. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, now uppercase as a class name doesn't do anything, doesn't mean anything, doesn't do anything for me. But now I can come into my CSS, I can create a selector that selects all elements with a class of uppercase and makes the text inside them uppercase. So now, even if sometime down the line I decide I want mobile apps to be capitalized, all I need to do is add class equals uppercase to this H1. As I move forward, or if I add more content to my site, rather than have to jump from HTML to CSS, select the new heading that I want to be capitalized, and add another property, all I need to do is add the uppercase class. I've created for myself a custom utility class that will turn anything I add it to uppercase. Okay. Now, what other patterns do I see? I also see 2 headings. God, I gotta stop that. 2 headings, which are this soft red color. I'm gonna find out what color this is. Let me. right, so what color is this red? There's the hex code right there. Works for me. So to start, I'll make the class selector for this first. I'll call it red heading. And it will simply have the color property of this red hex code. And now to what are we good at? I'm going to add, in addition to uppercase, a red heading class. And to our philosophy, there it is, I'm going to add a red heading class. And just like that, these two headings will now be this red color. All right, now let's take some time and add a little more CSS and make sure we're on the right track here. So I know I have div left and div right, which need to line up next to each other. So what I'm going to do is make them display inline block, and I'm going to give them a width of 50%. Let's load my page. It's going to look awful. All right, here's what we got. Oh, I am super zoomed in. All right, so here's our page. Obviously, it looks nothing like it's supposed to yet. That's completely okay. Let me first account for the space which line breaks in HTML take up when dealing with inline block elements. So I'm going to comment out the line break between each div with a class of left and each div with a class of right. And that's just going to make sure that they will, in fact, sit next to each other with widths of 50% and a display property of inline block. Now, let's see. There's our phone. Reload. There we go. It's on the right side. Phone's on the right side. Text is on the right side. Let's get our text pushed up to the top. I'll start by trying to select all divs and give them a property of vertical align top. What are some helpful sources on JavaScript? Hey, can you introduce yourself? Whoever asked that question? Looks like trinitrophenylnitramine, a chemist. Well, regardless, this webinar is on weeks 1 through 5, which does not cover JavaScript. So if you want some helpful sources for JavaScript, and hey, Trinity, if you want some helpful sources for JavaScript, you can either ask me outside the scope of this webinar on Slack, where I am available basically 24/7, or you can wait until I host webinars on JavaScript. Since I do these weekly and only the first one is on material other than JavaScript, you won't have to wait very long. I do them in cycles of 4. First one is always going to be weeks 1 through 5. So if you're interested in JavaScript help, reach out to me personally or come back next week. All right. As a side note, you know what? No. I'm going to reel it in there. Okay, where was I? So vertical align top, let's reload. Really wish it would stop asking me that. Hold on. Okay, good. save my CSS, reload, and now they are aligned to the top. How did I align the image to the right side again? Well, good question, Carlos. So think about how the site is laid out in terms of HTML right now. We're looking at this section here. So what we have is a div with a class of left. Everything that I've highlighted right now is a div with a class of left and a div with a class of right. So divs, as we know, are really just boxes. They're empty boxes that contain content or sections of our site. So I have two boxes, one which contains a lot of text, a lot of copy, and one which contains our image. So what I did is I selected both of them and I changed their display property to inline block and gave them a width of 50%. So to demonstrate that a little more clearly, let me pull up a code pen and I'm going to create just two divs. Okay, and I'm going to select all my divs. I'm going to give them a height, 200 pixels. I'll give them a background color. And I'll give them a border so we can see them. Okay, there are my two divs. Now I haven't affected... Is my text big enough for you to see? Do you want me to zoom in? I'm going to zoom in. Change this height to 100 pixels. Okay, now as you can see from my CSS, I have not affected the display property of this div at all, of these divs, pardon me. Divs are naturally what are called block elements. And a block element is an element which takes up all of the available horizontal space. So all of the width of whatever they're sitting in this case, my body. All of the horizontal space. And they always start on a new line. As a result, they don't allow other elements to sit next to them. Even text elements are block elements, many of them, such as these H1s. Okay, I created two H1s down here. Now if I open my inspector, if I asked you how much space are these H1s taking up, most people think they're only taking up this much space. But what I'd challenge you to do is actually check in your inspector. When I hover over either of these elements, or if I select them in my inspector, we can see they're actually taking up all of the available space. All of it. That's because these H1s are also naturally block elements. So I'm going to select them and change their display property to inline block. And see what happens? They jump right next to each other. I can do the same for the divs. If I can get my cursor under control, there we go. I can do the same for the divs. Only difference is because they have no content, because they're divs, they're going to need a little bit of a width. And now everything will line up. So we changed these elements from block elements, which take up all the width, to inline block elements, which only take up the space needed by their content, or the space that you tell them to take up. So, good question, Carlos, but the correct question, or my question and answer to your question, is not how did I align the image to the right, it's how did I align the div which contains the image to the right. I aligned the div with the class of left to the left and made it 50% as wide as my page. And then I aligned the div with the class of right next to it and made it also 50% the width of my page. So collectively, they take up the full width of my page, but one sits on the left, one sits on the right. They sit next to each other. I hope that answers your question. It's something you will have to do over and 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 over again, and should do over and over again, because this is the kind of very simple but very critical task that you will need to execute to get your layouts in order and to be able to make any layout imaginable. If you can do this in your sleep, you are good. All right, so back to the replica. It looks like there's a lot of padding on this text on the left, so I'm going to go ahead and select the div with the class of left inside the section with the ID of what are we good at. So this is going to be a very specific selector. Section, hashtag, what are we good at? Okay, that's the section. That's selecting the section with the ID of what are we good at. And then div.left. So this is going to be selecting the div or any div with the class of left inside of the section with the ID of what are we good at. I'm going to give it a padding of 30 pixels. Okay, let's push that up to 50 pixels. Okay, now I want you to notice how it pushed my image down to the next line. This is because padding will actually increase the width of an element. The width of an element refers exclusively to its content box. So for those of you who haven't hit the box model yet, you will immediately. And remember, any element is comprised of content, padding, border, and margin. Content, padding, border, and margin. Those are the 4 components of the box model. And the width of an element, this width of 50%, only applies to the content box, not all of this, which is what has now expanded the width of my element and pushed the div to the right of it down to the next line. To fix that, there is a way we can tell the browser to use everything inside the border as the measure of width rather than just the content. Blue box is the content, green box is the padding. So the width of this element, this whole element, is actually 50% plus 50 pixels on each side. 50 and 50. So 50% plus 100 pixels, which is too much. I'm going to change that by selecting everything on my page, applying a property of box sizing with a value of border box. Okay, the default for this, which we're seeing now, is content box, but I'm going to change it to border box, and that will allow div.right to line up again with div.left. Okay. Now let's deal with this mobile app section. So that's this div here. I'm going to give it an ID of mobile apps. Actually, am I going to do that? Is it part of any other pattern I can see? I could argue it has the same purple background as this one here. But I'm not going to complicate things right now. ID of mobile apps. So let me go ahead and select the element with the ID of mobile apps. And I'm going to give it that purple background color to start. So let me get what color that is. Blue background color. I stand corrected. All right. Next thing I want all the text in here to be white. Okay. But I want the H1 in here to be this yellow color, that yellow color. All right. Now I see some space between my text and the borders of this purple box too. So I might want to rethink my padding on div.left up here. Instead, rather than applying it to div.left, I'm going to apply it to the divs inside of div.left, inside the what are we good at section. And let's see how that's going to change my layout here. There we go. And that looks a little more on point. Now, let's just try lining up some of these elements a little bit while we're here. So we got mobile apps, which is this box here. And then we're going to want to move the image inside of div.right. So before I go any further, I'm going to reorganize my CSS just a little bit. I'm going to make sure I have some generic selectors up at the top, class selectors, more specific class selectors, ID selectors, and then the most specific selectors at the bottom, just to keep things clean and organized. Okay. So I want both of these things, this mobile app section and this image inside the div with the class of right, to be positioned relative. So I can move them just a little bit relative to where they are now. So I'm going to select, let's do a new selector just because. Got the mobile app selector and the what are we good at space div.right space img selector. And they're both going to be positioned relative. Move this down to the bottom. Okay, now that they're positioned relative, where do I want to move mobile apps? I want to move it a little bit to the right and a little bit down. So I'm going to try using percentages here. I'm going to try left 20%, top 5%. Not terrible. Not so bad. I'm going to dial back the vertical padding on this guy, though. So let's do that here. Okay, feels a little better. Now, so far so good, but we want to make sure mobile apps is on top of the image. So I'm also going to assign it a z-index of 5. I'm just pulling that number out of hot air. Okay, getting there. And now let's move the image down a little bit and make it actually a little shorter. It's a little too tall. I'm getting a little nitpicky too soon, which is not how I would recommend approaching this, but we're here, so why not? My goal here is to expose you to as much CSS and HTML as possible within the next 45 minutes. All right, so let's select this image next. And I'm going to move it down also about 5%. And I'm going to give it a maximum height of, let's see what its height is now by selecting it. So it looks like 640 by 394. So let's give it a max height of 350 pixels. Definitely want to push it down more. Oh, it's not moving. Let's see why. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm using percentage in a vertical. Yeah, that's not something you can do. Not like this. Percentages with regards to height or top or bottom, when you're not dealing with... yeah, percentages can just be very, very tricky. So be careful when trying to use percentages in a vertical context. So I'm going to change that to 50 pixels, and that puts it about where I'd like. I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, moving forward, our philosophy. Let's first change the widths a little bit, because it's not perfectly 50% down the middle, right? So, div.left, all divs with a class of left and divs with a class of right have display inline block and width 50%. But I'm going to select specifically the div with the class of left and the div with the class of right inside the element with the ID of philosophy. Let me do this in separate selectors because they're both different sizes. Now left is going to have a width of, let's try 40%, and right a width of 60%. Okay, pretty good. Now I'm going to give div.right some padding here. I'm going to give div.left min height of, let's see how tall this div on the right is. 639 pixels tall. Wait. 634 pixels tall. So how about I give this a min height of 640 pixels. Good. The reason I gave a min height, I'll show you in just a moment. Let me find that red heading color, copy it, and apply it to this div.left inside our philosophy section, but change color to background color. All right. If I did not have a minimum height here for this element, if I turn off min height, we're not going to see any of the background color because, again, it has no content. So without any content and without any height, you're not going to see a div. It's just going to collapse. Okay. Now let's add some space between these two sections before we go any further. Now it's going to be pretty easy. I'm going to select all my sections, and I'm going to give them a padding of 50 pixels vertically and 0 left and right. It creates a nice big space in between all of our sections. Now I see this white stripe along the sides of my page. I don't like that, so I'm going to get rid of that by selecting my body tag, giving it a margin of 0. Okay, now it's totally flush. All is well, things look good. Let's reposition this image here. So how am I going to select it? We have the image inside, that's this one here. The image inside the div with the class of right inside the philosophy section. So the element with the ID of philosophy, the div with the class of right, all divs with the class of right, all image elements. All image elements inside divs with the class of right, inside the element with the ID of philosophy. Going to position and relative, although to be honest, I could simply tag this up there and use top, let's try 10%, 50 pixels again, and right 20%. Not far enough, not by a long shot. So let's open our inspector, select the element, and start playing with these values. 40%, maybe 50% looks good. And definitely should go down a little further. $80 pixels looks good to me. Ooh. Oh no. Alright, so 80 pixels down and about 50% over. Okay, so far so good. Now let's work on that hero section a little bit, and then we'll start working on, we'll try to match the font. I don't think we're going to have time to get through the entire site, unfortunately, but maybe we can build on this next week. So I'll work on the hero image, hero section. We'll match the fonts a little bit, and we'll noodle what we have. Like I'll get that arrow icon in, and then we'll see where we can pick it up next week. Not next week, but the next time I do this series. So, hero section. Let's start by adding that background image. Select my hero section, give it a background image property. File path is going to be ... Because remember, we're in our main.css file. We need to first navigate outside of our CSS style sheet, outside of our CSS folder into our main project folder. Then we're going to look for the image folder. So img is the next stop, and then we're going to look for the hero image file. If you're not yet comfortable with relative file paths in image elements, in your link tag, in background images, that is something you need to practice immediately, critically. It is absolutely impossible to progress if you do not understand how relative file paths work. So please prioritize that. It's not meant to discourage you if you're having trouble with it. It's meant for you to realize that that is something you do need to focus on and prioritize above all else. Okay, so that should add a background image to our hero section, and indeed it does. Let's also make the text white. Okay. Now, there's also this purple overlay on our image. So that can be tricky for some people to handle. I'm going to show you one real way to take care of this. Inside of our hero section, I'm going to create a div and give it a class of overlay. I'm creating this div behind our text, okay, which is important. Now I'm going to make our hero section position relative. Then I'm going to select our elements with the class of overlay inside our hero section and make it position absolute. I'm going to give it a width of 100%. a height of 100%, a background color of purple, and I'm also going to give it a top property of 0, left 0. Last thing I want to do is give my hero some height because it's much too short right now. Let's try 600 pixels. Okay, so we have an absolutely positioned element inside a relatively positioned element. So I can position this overlay wherever I want inside my hero section without affecting the text. I made it as tall as my hero section and as wide as my hero section. Gave it a background color of purple and made sure that it's positioned in the top left corner. So at full size, positioned in the top left corner, it's going to perfectly overlay the entire hero section, which is great, but not exactly what we want, right? So I'm going to add to this, and we can do this in our inspector, a background blend mode of, pardon me, a mix blend mode. Mix blend mode. Let's try overlay. Not quite. Color. Color burn, color dodge, darken. Darken might work if we find the right hue. Difference, exclusion, hard light, hue, inherit, initial light and luminosity multiply normal. Overlay, saturation, screen, soft light, unset. Alright, I don't like any of those. So instead, I'm going to make the background color slightly transparent. That's something like that. And we will change its color to this. A little more purple in there. It's not a perfect match, and in a perfect world we would actually take the background image and make it slightly transparent. In fact, that's another way to do this. Yeah, let's do that. Let's take this background color. Hero section, in addition to the background image, the hero section is going to have a background color. And I'll turn off the background color of the overlay for a moment. And let's change the background blend mode of the hero image to no, I don't like it. Never mind. Back to how we had it. So let's find the perfect amount of transparency for this color. All right, that'll do. And use the RGBA format for the color. And there we are. It's not perfect, not a one-for-one solution, but it's a good place to start, and I'm reasonably happy with it for now. Again, in an ideal world, what we'd actually do is edit the source image, and for those of you who have access to, say, Photoshop or anything like that, it's very, very easy. I might crunch the levels on this. I might even colorize it a bit. Just so that it matches the final layout that we're going for. And then you would take that initial source image and use it as your background image. But we're excuse me. We're gonna move forward as is. Now, let's deal with the text inside the hero image, inside the hero section. So inside the hero section, we've got the H6 and the H1. I'm going to put these both inside of a div. give them a class of text. And this is just so I can easily affect both of these text elements at the same time, which I'd like to. So, hero.text. Going to position it relatively. Going to give it a z-index of 5, so it jumps on top of the overlay. And actually, let's use absolute for this. Since we already have the hero section positioned relatively, I can safely move an absolutely positioned element around. Let's do this in the inspector so we can test it out first. I'm going to select that div with the class of text. And let's push it 30% from the top, 30% from the left, maybe a little more, 40, something like that. See how responsively that behaves. Not bad. That would be a good imperfect solution. Okay, so if you want to do that, certainly go for it. However, there is a more perfect way to achieve a perfect centering of an element like this. First thing I want to do is I want to make it inline block so it doesn't take up a lot of width. I'm going to add top 50%, left 50%, which actually has centered perfectly the top left corner of this box. Not quite what we want. And then we can add transform, translate x minus 50%, translate y minus 50%. Unless I spelled something wrong. Transfrom. There we go. And now it's perfectly centered. So what happened is we moved, excuse me a moment. Hello? Great, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so we moved this box 50% of the height of the section element down and 50% of the width of the section element right. And then we translated it 50% of the box's own width backwards and 50% of the box's own height upwards. So that perfectly centers this div. And this will work in all scenarios on an absolutely positioned element inside of a relatively positioned parent. So I'm going to add that there. All right, now that we've made it this far, we're pretty good actually. We've got a really nice start to this replica. We could keep pushing through additional sections, but I think it's going to be more useful right now to try to match some of the fonts and incorporate some of these smaller touches like the icons next to the images, little dots there, things like that. And just kind of nailing some of the typographical treatments that a lot of students tend to overlook because they themselves are not designers. That's a whole different thing. I get that. But as developers, you still will often need to be able to replicate a designer's creations. So choosing the fonts is not your job, but knowing how to implement them definitely is. So let's jump onto Google Fonts. For those of you who are ambitious out there, there are in fact tools where you can match a font using a photo. You upload a photo of text and the platform will do its best to match the font for you. But I'm going to try to source something as close as we can find from Google Fonts. So I open up Google Fonts, and I know that this is a sans serif font. It doesn't have any of the curly cues of Times New Roman or anything like that. So I'm going to turn off serif fonts. I know it's not a handwriting font, so I'm going to turn off handwriting. And to try and match it as carefully as I can, I'm going to type in Creative UI and UX Studio. And I'm going to select Apply to All Fonts. Now this is a very bold version, so I'm probably not going to see something that looks exactly like what we see here, but I'm going to do my best. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's the very first one that we saw. Pretty sure it's Roboto. Very common Google font. But this would be the method you would use to try your best to find a nice match for a designer's font, especially if you're not able to communicate directly with the designer and say, hey, what font did you use? And where can I get it? So I'm going to scroll back up. 1 second. All right, this should be the last interruption. So I'm going to scroll all the way up, and we're going to use Roboto. Might not be. I'm reasonably sure it's Roboto, just super bold. So I'm going to click on Roboto, and to use this font, all we need to do is click on Select this font, and this tab which popped up here at the bottom. I'm going to open it up. And before I just move ahead to import it into my site, I want to click on Customize, and I want to make sure I get the boldest possible bold that this font supports. So I click on Black 900. I don't see any super thin font, so I'm not going to worry about thin or anything in between. And then I'm simply going to copy this link tag, which we can simply paste into the head of our index.html, and this will allow us to use this font in either of these configurations. Here, where it says specify in CSS, it will show you exactly how to declare this font family in your CSS. So I'm going to do this inside our body, keep it nice and general. And now everything on my inside my body will be using Roboto font. And I'm going to find, well, let's just select all of my H1s, H2s, H3s, H4s, H5s, and H6s, and increase the font weight on these to that black 900. 900. Let's see how that works. Okay. Looks a little better. We're still going to need to do some fiddling, and obviously they need to be a lot thicker, but we can work on that. For now, let's start by making these headings much bigger. So all of these heading elements, let's give them a font size of, let's try 3 rem. That's, it's not bad. It's a little smaller. Let's try, no, not 4. 2.75. Feels a little more appropriate. I'm going to go with that. 2.75. Okay, problem is this welcome shouldn't be that color, and it shouldn't be that size. It should, in fact, be the size of our mobile apps header. So let's find it down here. That means this is a pattern to me. If I only see two elements that use it, it's a pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this into a dot yellow heading class. And I'm going to apply this class name to the mobile apps heading and to this welcome heading. But I do need to get a little more specific with the element with the class of yellow heading inside of the element with the class of text, inside the element with the ID of hero, which is namely this guy. And let's first try an initial font size. Initial, if you remember, is a CSS property which will reset, CSS value, excuse me, which will reset any CSS property. So while this sets all H6s to have a font size of 2.75 RAM, this font size initial will reset the font size of this specific H6 back to its original default value. It should be a little bigger than that, though. Let's try 1.25. A little bigger than that. All right, good enough. Now we want to get rid of some of the space in between the two. I'm actually convinced this is no longer Roboto, but I'm going to leave it. It's too, it's not that it's too fat, too black, or too bold, or anything like that. It's that it's too short. The characters are actually too short. So the space between these two is coming from a lot of margin on both of them. So I'm going to get rid of that margin. Let's select everything inside of the element with the class of text, inside the element with the ID of hero, and give them a margin of 0. Okay, better. But I want a little bit of margin. So let's change this to maybe a margin of 15 pixels and 0. How does that look? A little too much. Let's try 10. Alright, that'll do. I'll buy that for $1. Any questions so far before I keep noodling at text and layout and stuff like that? Alright then. So I'm going to try to imitate the line break here, and what are we good at? Let's select that text element and insert a line break after the R. What are we good at? There we go. And then what's next? Our philosophy. There should be a line break there. Our break philosophy. I see something else here that bothers me, though. Our philosophy is actually lined up with the top of this big red section here. And it looks like there's a little more padding in between the two. So let's work on fixing that. Where's that space coming from? There's a bit of padding on this div.right, but our philosophy also has a lot of margin. So I'm going to try something right now, which is to reset the margin on all of my heading elements, which I still have selected up here. I'm going to reset their margin to 0 but give them all a margin bottom of, let's do 12 pixels. And I will get rid of this because we no longer need it with this configuration. All right, so that clears up all those automatic margins. That still looks good. Now we just have the padding on div.right in our philosophy section to deal with. So philosophy div.right. Let's do padding 0 on top. And there we go. It's could probably be moved up a couple of pixels only because of the natural space above the actual characters. Can't do a whole lot about that. And if you wanted to, though, you could make it position relative and just punch it up 2 pixels and it would probably be lined up perfectly. But I'm not even sure the original accounts for that, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Okay, let's see what we can do about trying to match the some of the leading a little bit more. Actually, let's try and get creative. So I do think there's some leading difference in between their font and ours, but I don't think that's worth us spending a whole lot of time on. So let's brainstorm and try and think of a unique way to try and make our text look more like theirs. At least the heading elements. You know, I'm not worried about the paragraphs. Well, one way you might try it, try to make this text look fatter, is let's give these elements a text shadow of 1 pixel, 0, 0, and white. Doesn't seem to do much, so let's increase 1 up to 2, 3, go back down to 2. I like that, and let's couple that with a letter spacing property of, let's try way too much. Okay, let's try that and then punch this up a little bit more. 4. Looks a little cheap though, as it will. So let's add multiple text shadows in here. Down to 3. Maybe bring this down a little bit, 0.075. Alright, that kind of works. It's pretty hacky. I would never ever recommend it, but it's a fun exercise to try and see how well you can still too much. How well you can imitate or use CSS in a creative fashion to imitate, especially font like this. My recommendation would be try to match it more carefully, spend more time on that, but it's still good to know how to use these kinds of properties, and they do have other uses as well. Letter spacing in particular can be great if you're trying to make a very creative text layout. But I'm going to turn these off, and we're going to try a different, also hacky solution using the transform property. We're going to use the scale x value. We're going to try scaling at 1.2. And bam, it's pretty close. Let's bring it down to 1.15. What this is doing is literally stretching the heading elements so that they are 115% of their normal width. So let's try, just because we're playing now, adding that to all of our heading elements. it does actually make our text look a little more in line with the original, but notice that they're now pushing to the left. So we actually need to account for that in the same property. In addition to scale x, I'm going to give translate x property of 15%. Too much. Much too much. Oh, that's right, because it's half of 15%, so that would be 7.5%. There we go. And now they're right back where they started. So if we're scaling them to 15% of their width, that means they're overflowing their original space by 15%. And they overflow evenly. So that's 15% dispersed on the left side and the right side. We only want to push them in from the left side. So that's half of that excess, 7.5%. We're moving them 7.5% over horizontally. Now they're where they need to go. They look a little closer to the source font. And yeah, we can keep pushing ahead. All right, let's get some of this spacing a little more in line. Definitely the padding needs to change. The philosophy section, the mobile apps. Where am I looking? What are we good at? Div.left.div. Okay, let's try 70 pixels of horizontal padding. Yeah, all right. It honestly looks like the two of them have... All right, let's do it that way. $60 pixels of padding here, and then let's go ahead and give this whole section a little bit of padding left. Which is going to create the space that What Are We Good At needs, but it's going to help keep mobile apps maintain that left padding. We could add additional selectors as needed, but I don't like using more selectors than are required. It just tends to get out of hand very quickly. As is, this is not the cleanest CSS ever, but that's not the priority right now. Okay. All right. Now philosophy. Where are you? Here we go. Div.right, padding 0, 50 pixels. Let's try pushing this up to 60. Let's try 70. Yeah, that'll do it. Now the other thing I see is, notice how the philosophy text is actually justified almost with the edge of this image. So let's see if we can accomplish that. Best way to do it is by actually changing the width of that paragraph element. So if I give it a width of, say, 70%, it's going to be 70% the width of its container. And look at that. Just that looks like it works. So let's do that. I'll select the paragraphs inside div.right, inside philosophy, give them a width of 70%. And there we go. Now, I'm noticing one side effect of stretching our headings, and that's that we have a little bit of overflow here. We're now able to slide to the right because philosophy is actually overflowing our body, since it's now 115 its own width, 115% of its own width. So to account for that, it's actually quite easy. Let's add to our body a property of overflow x hidden. And now we can no longer scroll to the left or right. Anything that overflows the body along the x-axis. So anything that overflows the body horizontally is now going to be completely hidden. All right. Yeah. I'm kind of running out of steam, so let's go ahead and add that arrow icon inside mobile apps, and I'll call it a day there, and we can actually pick this up next week. But some other things that I would want to consider at this stage are, I think the paragraph text is not actually black. And frankly, even if it is, it shouldn't be. All of you almost never want to use pure black text on your websites. You can, it's not a bad thing, but it just tends to look a little janky. So what I'd actually recommend is using a color that's almost black if you want that kind of effect. There's black text. Let's try something like here. Something like that. It just tends to make your text appear a lot softer and easier to look at. It may not be, the effect may not be too obvious on the live stream, but it can really make a difference. You do want to be careful, though, that your text doesn't become too hard to read. That's not bad, but, you know, something like about 40% value just tends to make big text walls look a lot cleaner and feel a lot more modern. That harsh black text doesn't really have a place unless you're going for a very monochromatic look, like distinctly black and white, and only black and white. Okay, so the arrow icon. Let's go ahead and see if Font Awesome has an arrow icon. This is a very narrow arrow by the looks of it. So I don't love that one. Or that one. Let's try searching in Font Awesome. That'll work. There it is. But it is a part of Font Awesome 5 Pro, so let's just find an image, since I'm not going to pull up an icon library right now. And I'm also not going to worry about copyright infringement, since we're just practicing here, and no one's planning on making money off of this site. Alright, let's make things easy. Bear with me. All right, that's good enough. There we go. I'm going to save this file as a PNG because I'm sure some of you have noticed JPEGs versus PNGs lately. PNGs actually support transparent backgrounds. So I can put this arrow on top of, hey, what color should the arrow be? Yellow. Okay. I can put this arrow on top of any colored background, and there won't be, say, a white box around it. It will actually allow the background color to show through. Okay. Power of Photoshop. So I'm going to put this arrow inside this mobile apps section. Underneath the paragraph element, I'm going to create a div, which is going to contain the arrow. So the div will have an ID of arrow. And inside this div will be the image. Okay. And now, let's go ahead and select arrow, the element with the ID of arrow, and make sure it has a width of, let's try 100 pixels, and a height of 100 pixels. And it's got a unique background color, so let's see if I can figure out what that is. That. All right, background color. And there we go. Now I want to make that arrow image fit inside the arrow div, because right now the image itself is actually so big that it's overflowing its container. So to do that, I'm going to give it a width of 100%. Zero pixels by 0 pixels, which means only too much padding in here, that's why. Alright, so I'll hard code it as 100 pixels. Okay. No, we're going to do this right. The arrow image is going to have a width of 100%. The arrow div, the containing div, is going to have a padding of 0. Something's overriding it. Yeah. So I'm going to need to make my selector here more specific. What are we good at? All right. There we go. Now let's make this container a circle. Border radius 50%. Now it's a circle. Let me see if it has a little bit of a box shadow. I don't know if it's easy to see there, but there's a little bit of a box shadow on that arrow button. So let's go ahead and add that as well. here. Box shadow. Let's do 0, 0, 15 pixels, gray. Need much more than that, much more blur. All right. So what color do I want that box shadow? Let me go ahead and move this element first. So I'm going to reposition it because it's inside an absolutely positioned element inside a relatively positioned element. I can actually move it with much more control. And then about 50 pixels from the right. Oops. All right, it's too big. It's definitely too big. Looks a little better. Now let's make that background, that box shadow, an appropriate color. Oops. All right, that'll work. Let's make it a little less blurry. About 20. Now it's feeling a little dark. Yeah. All right, box shadow, 20 pixels. Hex code. And then we just need to move the arrow itself. I'm going to use the same vertically centering trick that I taught you guys in the last version of this webinar and even just earlier inside the same webinar. And it's perfectly centered. It's a little wide though, so okay, that'll do it. All right, everybody, I'm going to call it there. For all of you who are still watching, thanks. For those of you who are watching in the future, I hope this was at least a helpful exercise. I will stick with this page. In the next weeks 1 through 5 webinar, we will try to finish this. After that, we will try to build it using Bootstrap, since we do need to practice Bootstrap. And we'll try to make it fully responsive using media queries. And eventually, once we're done with that, I'd like to push it into JavaScript and start making a true collapsible nav bar. Maybe we'll make some of our own versions of this page that we can interact with. These buttons will actually go somewhere, things like that. So I hope this will be a good learning experience, not just for this 1-2 hour session, but for all sessions in the future as well. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me. In the meantime, I'm actually going to post the code that I've written for this in the description to this video so that anybody who wants to jump in later on and follow along will be able to. Alright, thanks very much, guys, and I'll post the recording very soon in the Slack channel.